The galactic peace station orbited the neutral moon of Kepler 442c like a giant metal donut, all gleaming chrome and diplomatic pretensions. Its designers had clearly never met a toddler of any species, because the place was about as child-proof as a glass house in a meteor shower. Captain Violet stood in what the aliens generously called a youth supervision facility, but what any reasonable person would recognize as barely controlled chaos. Three small, furry, scaly, and decidedly non-human creatures were currently engaged in what appeared to be an elaborate game of destroy everything the grown-ups think is important. "Ma'am," called Lieutenant Hendricks from the doorway, his voice carrying that special tone reserved for delivering news that would ruin someone's entire week. "The Diplomatic Council wants to see you." Violet didn't look up from where she was untangling the Nexarian kit from a ventilation grate. The little furball had somehow managed to phase shift halfway through solid metal, a neat trick that nobody had bothered mentioning in the species briefing files. "Tell them I'm busy preventing an interstellar incident," she replied, finally extracting the kit, who immediately began purring like a malfunctioning engine. "Unless they want to explain to the Nexarian Empire why their ambassador's offspring got stuck in our air conditioning system." The kit, about the size of a house cat, but with 6 legs, crystalline fur that shimmered like starlight, and eyes that held far too much intelligence for something that had just spent 20 minutes trying to hunt a maintenance drone, settled into Violet's arms with obvious contentment. Across the room, the wraithling pup had cornered said maintenance drone, and was now engaged in what could only be described as the galaxy's most adorable standoff. The pup looked like someone had crossed a wolf with Shadow itself, all dark fur and silver markings that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. It was currently making low, rumbling sounds that the drone's sensors were interpreting as a system malfunction. "Good hunting technique," Violet called over. "But remember what we discussed about not actually eating the station's equipment." The pup's ears perked up, and it immediately abandoned the drone to trot over to Violet, tail wagging with enough enthusiasm to power a small generator. Meanwhile, the Gorthak hatchling had discovered the fascinating properties of the waiting room furniture. What had once been an elegant diplomatic seating arrangement was now slowly dissolving under the influence of the hatchling's naturally acidic saliva. The little reptilian creature, imagine a miniature dragon designed by someone with a sense of humor and a fondness for rainbow scales, looked up at Violet with an expression of pure innocence. "And what did we say about the furniture?" Violet asked, though her tone held more amusement than reprimand. The hatchling made a series of chirping sounds. That roughly translated to, "But it tastes like bureaucracy," which, honestly, was probably accurate. Lieutenant Hendricks cleared his throat. "Ma'am, the council was quite insistent. Something about proper species separation protocols and unprecedented bonding anomalies." Violet finally looked up, fixing him with the kind of stare that had made grown Marines reconsider their life choices. "Let me guess. A bunch of alien desk jockeys who've never spent 5 minutes with an actual child are suddenly experts on xenobiology?" "That would be an accurate assessment, ma'am." The irony wasn't lost on her. 6 months ago, she'd been commanding a patrol cruiser on the Outer Rim, dealing with pirates and territorial disputes like a proper military officer. Then came the incident with the Centaurian trade delegation. Apparently, preventing a war by telling both sides they were being idiots wasn't considered diplomatically appropriate. Her punishment: babysitting duty on the galaxy's most boring space station. Except it hadn't turned out to be boring at all. The 3 youngsters had been dropped off 8 days ago while their parents attended the kind of high-level negotiations that could determine the fate of star systems, but moved at roughly the speed of continental drift. The species files had been incomplete. Highly intelligent but manageable juveniles was apparently diplomatic speak for small, adorable weapons of mass destruction with abandonment issues. The first day had been a disaster. The alien child care specialists, beings who had advanced degrees in developmental psychology and no practical experience whatsoever, had tried to implement structured educational activities and species-appropriate behavioral modification techniques. The kit had phased through 3 walls trying to escape. The pup had howled at a frequency that shattered every piece of glassware in a 50-meter radius. The hatchling had melted through its containment pen and was found 3 hours later, fast asleep in the station's recycling center, apparently having eaten half a ton of scrap metal. That's when they'd called in Violet. Her approach was unconventional. Instead of trying to suppress their predatory instincts, she'd found ways to redirect them. The kit's phase shifting became a game of cosmic hide-and-seek. The pup's hunting drive was channeled into elaborate treasure hunts through the station's maintenance tunnels. The hatchling's need to dissolve things was satisfied by a steady supply of old equipment, marked for recycling anyway. More importantly, she'd done something the alien experts hadn't thought to try. She'd listened to them. Not just their vocalizations, but their body language, their emotional needs, their fear at being separated from everything familiar. They weren't just juvenile specimens of apex predator species. They were kids. Scared, lonely kids who missed their parents and didn't understand why they'd been left with strangers on a cold metal station that smelled wrong and felt wrong and had no comfortable places to hide. So Violet had made it comfortable. She'd requisitioned extra blankets and built them a proper nest in the corner of the supervision facility. She'd learned their favorite foods. Apparently, Nexarian kits had a weakness for earth chocolate. Wraithling pups loved anything that crunched, and Gorthak hatchlings would eat literally anything, including furniture. She'd told them stories, taught them card games, and somehow ended up becoming their de facto pack leader. The alien psychologists were baffled. Humans were supposedly weak, non-predatory, lacking the natural dominance markers that young predators would instinctively respond to. Yet here were 3 of the galaxy's most dangerous juvenile species treating a human female like their mother. "Ma'am?" Lieutenant Hendricks was still waiting. Violet sighed and gently set the kit down next to its companions. All 3 immediately huddled together, watching her with the kind of intense focus that suggested they knew something was about to change. "All right, you 3, she said, crouching down to their level. "I have to go talk to some very important, very boring adults. I need you to stay here and try not to dissolve, phase through, or eat anything expensive while I'm gone. Can you do that for me?" 3 sets of alien eyes stared at her with absolute trust. The pup whined softly. The kit's purr dropped to an anxious rumble. The hatchling chirped something that sounded distinctly worried. "I'll be back," she promised, the same words she'd said every day for the past week. "I always come back." But as she followed Lieutenant Hendricks toward the administrative levels, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was about to make a very, very stupid decision. The Galactic Peace Station had strict protocols for everything, from diplomatic immunity to waste recycling. What it didn't have, apparently, was any understanding of what happened when you tried to separate predator young from their chosen pack leader. They were about to learn. The council chamber looked like it had been designed by someone who'd read about intimidation in a textbook, but had never actually experienced it. All polished surfaces and uncomfortable angles, with chairs that seemed specifically engineered to make everyone sit at slightly awkward heights. Administrator Blaine dominated the head of the table like a self-important statue. his Altarian features arranged in what he probably thought was an expression of grave authority. Altarians, as a species, had evolved from something roughly equivalent to Earth's bureaucratic middle management. If bureaucratic middle management had developed opposable thumbs and a pathological need to file reports in triplicate. Blaine was tall, pale blue, and possessed the kind of perfectly symmetrical features that suggested his ancestors had spent millennia optimizing themselves for committee meetings. "Captain Violet," he began, consulting a datapad with the reverence most species reserved for religious texts, "we need to discuss the irregularities in your assigned duties." Security Chief Grack stood behind Blaine like a mountain with anger management issues. Krillians were what happened when evolution decided that subtle was for other species. 8 feet of muscle, bone, and what appeared to be professionally maintained intimidation, covered in skin that looked like it could stop small-caliber projectiles. His species had been warriors before they'd been recruited into galactic peacekeeping, and Grack wore his transition to law enforcement like an ill-fitting uniform. Irregularities? Violet kept her voice level, though something cold was starting to form in her stomach. "You mean the part where I actually got the job done?" Blaine's perfectly manicured fingers tapped against his datapad. The juveniles were assigned to qualified xenobiological specialists for proper species-appropriate care. Your intervention has resulted in unprecedented behavioral anomalies. You mean they stopped trying to escape and started eating their vegetables? They've formed an inappropriate attachment to a non-compatible species, Grack rumbled, his voice sounding like gravel in a cement mixer. Predator juveniles don't bond with herbivorous caregivers. It's biologically impossible. Violet almost laughed. Almost. Have you considered that maybe your textbooks are wrong? The silence that followed could have been weaponized. Dr. Kent, the station's xenobiologist, a nervous, twitchy being who looked like someone had crossed an accountant with a praying mantis, cleared his throat with a sound like shuffling papers. The behavioral patterns are indeed unusual. Young predators should respond only to dominant pack leaders of compatible species. The human bonding phenomenon suggests either a fundamental misunderstanding of predator psychology or what? Violet asked, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to know the answer. Or these particular juveniles are defective, Blaine said, with the kind of casual cruelty that only came from someone who'd never been responsible for anything more emotionally complex than a filing system. The cold in Violet's stomach crystallized into something much harder. Defective. Clearly, their instincts are malfunctioning if they're accepting leadership from a... Blaine consulted his notes again. A species classified as non-threatening with minimal pack dynamics and herbivorous dietary preferences. "I eat meat," Violet said quietly. "Irrelevant. The point is, we have 3 juveniles of apex predator species exhibiting aberrant behavior patterns. For the safety of the station and the success of the diplomatic negotiations, immediate corrective action is required." Grack stepped forward, and Violet noticed he wasn't alone. 2 more security officers had materialized at the chambers. Entrance, standard intimidation positioning, professional, efficient, and completely unnecessary if they were just planning to have a friendly chat. "The juveniles will be transferred to secure containment," Grack announced. "Proper isolation protocols will be implemented to prevent further contamination of their behavioral development." Violet stood slowly, her hands resting casually on the conference table. "You want to lock them up?" "We want to correct a dangerous anomaly," Blaine corrected. "They need to be separated from inappropriate influences and re-socialized with their own kind." Their own kind are at the negotiation table and won't be available for another 3 weeks. Then they'll wait in containment until proper arrangements can be made. The thing about spending 6 months on punishment duty was that it gave you a lot of time to think. Time to read regulations, study protocols, and understand exactly how the various species in the galactic community really felt about humans. Officially, humanity was a valued member of the Alliance, brave, resourceful, excellent at finding creative solutions to complex problems. Unofficially, they thought humans were cute, harmless, the galactic equivalent of a useful pet that could be trusted with simple tasks but shouldn't be allowed to make important decisions. "And what if I refuse?" Violet asked. Grak's hand moved to his sidearm with practiced casualness. Refusal would constitute insubordination and obstruction of security protocols. You'd be confined to quarters while the situation is resolved. "For their own safety," Blaine added with the kind of false concern that made Violet's trigger finger itch. She could see the entire scenario playing out. The cubs would be dragged away, confused and terrified, while she was locked in her quarters like a naughty child. The alien experts would implement their textbook solutions, the youngsters would be traumatized, and everyone would congratulate themselves on handling the situation properly. Except there was one small problem with their plan. "You know," Violet said conversationally, "I've been reading the station protocols. Fascinating stuff. Did you know that according to Section 15 of the Diplomatic Protection Act, I'm actually the legally designated guardian of those children while their parents are in negotiations?" Blaine's expression flickered. "That's a technicality." "Funny how technicalities become really important when they're inconvenient, isn't it?" Violet smiled, but it wasn't a particularly friendly expression. "I'm also curious about something else. When exactly did you file the emergency protocols that would override my guardianship status?" Dr. Kent made a sound like a deflating balloon. Grak's hand tightened on his weapon. Blaine's pale blue complexion shifted to something closer to gray. "There is no emergency," Violet continued. "No immediate threat, no justification for emergency containment. What you're proposing is the removal of children from their legal guardian based on— What? Your personal opinion that they're too friendly?" "The safety of the station," Grak began. "The safety of the station has improved significantly since I took over their care," Violet interrupted. "0 escape attempts, 0 property damage, 0 incidents requiring medical intervention. Your solution is to traumatize them because they don't fit your theoretical models?" Blaine stood abruptly, his datapad clutched like a shield. "Captain, you will surrender custody of the juveniles immediately, or face charges of insubordination, obstruction of diplomatic security, and—" He paused, clearly grasping for something that sounded official. "Improper influence over alien minors." Violet looked around the room, taking in the faces of beings who had convinced themselves they were doing the right thing. Bureaucrats and soldiers and scientists, all certain that their expertise trumped common sense. "No," she said. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Grak drew his sidearm, not pointing it at her, but making its presence known. "Captain Violet, by authority of station security, you are ordered to comply with administrative directives regarding the transfer of alien juveniles to appropriate containment facilities." "And by authority of basic human decency," Violet replied, "you can go stuff your administrative directives somewhere anatomically uncomfortable." What happened next happened very quickly. Grak lunged forward, clearly intending to restrain her while his subordinates secured the juveniles. Violet, who had been expecting exactly this move, dropped low and swept his legs out from under him. The massive Krillian hit the conference table with enough force to crack the surface. The other security officers moved in, but Violet was already rolling toward the exit. She might be smaller and weaker than most galactic species, but she'd been trained by people who understood that size wasn't everything in a fight. Alarms began blaring as she sprinted through the corridors toward the youth supervision facility. Behind her, she could hear Grok bellowing orders, his wounded pride adding volume to his already impressive vocal range. She reached the facility just as security forces were moving in from the other direction. Through the transparent walls, she could see the three youngsters huddled together, their heads turning back and forth as they tracked the approaching danger with predatory precision. The kit's fur was starting to shimmer in that way that meant it was preparing to phase shift. The pup was making a low sound that was setting off proximity alarms throughout the section. The hatchling's rainbow scales were darkening to something that looked decidedly less friendly. They knew. Somehow, they knew that someone was coming to take them away from their pack leader. Violet reached the facility entrance just as the first security team breached the opposite door. For a moment, she locked eyes with the kit. Those too intelligent, too ancient eyes in a face that should have been innocent. "Run," she whispered, and all hell broke loose. The first thing everyone learned about apex predators, usually too late to do anything useful with the information, was that there was a significant difference between domesticated and choosing to behave. The kit vanished. Not gradually, not with any kind of warning shimmer or fade effect. One moment it was there, pressed against the pup and hatchling in their defensive huddle, and the next moment it simply wasn't. The security officers who'd been moving toward the youngsters suddenly found themselves grasping empty air and looking around with the kind of confusion usually reserved for people who'd just watched a magic trick go very, very wrong. The pup's response was more direct. It opened its mouth and screamed. Now, wraithling pups in the wild used their vocalizations for pack coordination across vast distances. They could modulate frequency, pitch, and intensity to communicate everything from "I found food" to "run for your lives" to "everything is terrible" and "I want my mother." What came out of this particular pup was the audio equivalent of a tactical nuclear weapon. Every piece of glass in a 30-meter radius simply ceased to exist. Windows, display screens, light fixtures, the protective barriers around sensitive equipment, all of it transformed into glittering dust that hung in the air like deadly snow. The security officers who'd been advancing suddenly found themselves dealing with a sound that bypassed their ears and went straight to their nervous systems, telling every survival instinct they'd ever evolved that something much larger and much angrier was about to eat them. Most of them dropped their weapons and ran. The smart ones dropped their weapons and ran faster. The hatchling, meanwhile, had discovered something interesting about station architecture. It wasn't nearly as permanent as everyone assumed. Gorthak hatchlings produced a variety of acids for different purposes, some for digestion, some for territorial marking, some for defense. What most xenobiologists didn't realize was that frightened juveniles could produce a cocktail of all of them at once, creating something that could dissolve pretty much anything that wasn't specifically designed to withstand a chemical weapon. The floor began to smoke, then bubble, then develop what could only be described as aggressive potholes. "Containment breach in Section G!" Someone was shouting over the station's comm system. "Multiple containment breaches. All personnel evacuate to—" The lights went out. In the sudden darkness, Violet could hear the distinctive sound of metal being dissolved at an alarming rate, punctuated by the occasional crash as something structural gave up and decided to become something non-structural instead. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting everything in an apocalyptic red glow that made the destruction look even more dramatic than it actually was, which was saying something, because it was already pretty dramatic. "Where are they?" Grack's voice boomed from somewhere behind her. "Where did they go?" Violet almost laughed. Almost. The security chief was asking the wrong question entirely. It wasn't where they'd gone, it was where they were going. Predators, even young ones, didn't just run randomly when threatened. They had objectives. And right now, all three youngsters had the same objective: get back to their pack leader. The problem was, they didn't know where she was, so they were doing the sensible thing, removing every obstacle between them and everywhere she might be, using the most efficient methods available. The kit was phase-shifting through walls, floors, and ceilings, leaving behind a trail of very confused security personnel who kept reporting that their target had just vanished from sealed rooms. What they didn't understand was that the kit wasn't vanishing. It was taking shortcuts through dimensions that the station's architects hadn't bothered to secure. The pup was following scent trails with the kind of single-minded determination that made bloodhounds look casual. Unfortunately, Violet's scent was everywhere throughout the station, since she'd been working there for months. So the pup was systematically checking every location where she might be, announcing its presence with vocalizations that were turning the station's structural integrity into more of a suggestion than a requirement. The hatchling was solving the problem with characteristic directness. If there were barriers between it and its pack leader, then obviously the barriers needed to go. The fact that some of those barriers were load-bearing walls was apparently not its concern. Emergency evacuation protocols are now in effect, the station's AI announced, with the kind of artificial calm that suggested someone had programmed it to sound reassuring right up until the moment everything exploded. All non-essential personnel report to evacuation pods. Essential personnel report to... Oh, no. The essential personnel deck is... That's not supposed to be a liquid. Violet pressed herself against what remained of a corridor wall. As a security team rushed past, their equipment bouncing against their armor in a way that suggested they were more interested in getting somewhere else quickly than in actually securing anything. She couldn't blame them. The station was starting to sound like it was digesting itself. Captain Violet. Dr. Kent appeared around a corner, his usually pristine appearance now somewhat compromised by what appeared to be ceiling fragments and genuine panic. "You have to stop them. They're going to bring down the entire station." "Stop them?" Violet raised an eyebrow. "I thought they were just defective juveniles with malfunctioning instincts." "This is not the time for—" A sound like breaking glass interrupted him, followed by what sounded suspiciously like a section of the outer hull deciding to become an interior decoration. They're exhibiting coordinated behavior patterns consistent with military-grade tactical response. You mean they're smart, scared, and trying to get back to someone they trust? I mean they're demonstrating capabilities that were completely absent from their species profiles. Dr. Kent grabbed her arm with the kind of desperate strength that suggested he was reconsidering several major life choices. Phase shifting through quantum barriers, sonic attacks that bypass our defensive systems, acid production that can dissolve military-grade composites. These aren't normal juvenile behaviors. Violet gently removed his hand from her arm. Maybe your definition of normal needs work. Another crash echoed through the station, this one accompanied by the distinctive sound of atmosphere escaping through a hole that hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut with the kind of finality that suggested the station's AI was starting to panic. "They're not trying to destroy the station," Violet said, more to herself than to Dr. Kent. "They're trying to find me." The result is the same. The xenobiologist was now making the kind of hand gestures usually associated with religious experiences or complete mental breakdowns. "At this rate, they'll breach the reactor containment within the hour." That got Violet's attention. The reactor? The hatchling's acid production is following the station's primary power conduits. If it reaches the reactor core... He didn't need to finish. Even a small breach in reactor containment would turn the entire station into a very bright, very brief star. Violet started moving, not away from the destruction, but toward it. If the youngsters were following power conduits, then she knew exactly where they were heading. The reactor level was also where the main communication array was located, and where someone with military training would logically go to coordinate a defense or evacuation. They weren't just looking for her. They were thinking like her. "Where are you going?" Dr. Kent called after her. "To fix your mess," she called back. The corridors were getting more and more damaged as she descended toward the reactor level. Walls showed the telltale signs of acid damage. Floors had mysterious holes that seemed to extend in directions that hurt to look at, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with residual sonic energy. But there was something else, too. A pattern to the destruction. The kit's phase shifts were creating a path. Not random escapes, but deliberate shortcuts that avoided civilian areas. The pup's sonic attacks were targeting security barriers and military equipment, not general infrastructure. The hatchling's acid was eating through obstacles, but carefully avoiding life support systems. They weren't having a destructive tantrum. They were conducting a precision rescue operation. "Well," Violet muttered as she reached the reactor-level access, "at least someone taught them proper tactics." The access door had been dissolved. Not blasted, not forced. Precisely dissolved around the locking mechanism while leaving the surrounding structure intact. Through the opening, she could hear sounds that suggested the reunion was already in progress. Violet stepped through the doorway and found herself face to face with 3 pairs of eyes that held entirely too much intelligence, too much intent, and way too much satisfaction. The kit was perched on what remained of a control console, its crystalline fur shimmering with residual dimensional energy. The pup sat beside it, ears perked and tail wagging in a way that suggested it was extremely pleased with how everything had turned out. The hatchling was coiled around the base of the console like a rainbow-scaled guardian, occasionally dripping acid that was creating fascinating patterns in the floor plating. All 3 of them looked at her with expressions that clearly said, "What took you so long?" "Hey there, troublemakers," Violet said softly. "Miss me?" The response was immediate and overwhelming. The kit phase shifted directly into her arms, purring with enough intensity to register on seismic equipment. The pup bounded over and began enthusiastically attempting to knock her off her feet through sheer affection. The hatchling uncoiled itself and wound around her legs, chirping what sounded distinctly like "Pack Leader Safe Now." And, for just a moment, in the middle of what remained of a multi-billion-credit diplomatic station, surrounded by the evidence of the galaxy's most adorable act of terrorism, Violet felt completely at peace. Then the alarms started up again, and she remembered that they still had to deal with the adults. "Attention all personnel," Administrator Blaine's voice crackled through the damaged communication systems, sounding like someone who had just discovered that reality had a sense of humor, and it wasn't particularly kind. "The situation has been contained. Repeat, the containment breach has been managed." Violet looked around at the reactor level, which now resembled what might happen if a tornado had been given engineering training, and a serious attitude problem. Contained was apparently a very flexible term in diplomatic circles. The kit in her arms made a sound that was half purr, half chuckle, as if it understood exactly how ridiculous the official announcement was, which, given what she'd witnessed over the past 20 minutes, it probably did. "You three," she said, settling down cross-legged on the least damaged section of floor she could find. "We need to have a conversation about proportional response." The pup tilted its head, ears swiveling in that way that suggested it was listening but also keeping track of at least 6 other things happening simultaneously. The hatchling curled up beside her, occasionally letting out small chirps that sounded suspiciously like laughter. The kit just purred and kneaded her uniform with claws that could apparently phase through dimensions. "I know you were scared," Violet continued, gently scratching behind the kit's crystalline ears. "And I know you thought they were taking you away from me permanently. But maybe next time we could try the proportional response approach. You know, start with something that doesn't involve dissolving the station's infrastructure." The hatchling looked up at her with eyes that were far too ancient for something that was technically still a baby, then made a series of chirping sounds that clearly translated to something along the lines of, "They started it." "Fair point," Violet conceded. "They did try to separate us without asking anyone's opinion on the matter, including ours." The truth was, she was more impressed than alarmed. What the 3 youngsters had just accomplished wasn't random destruction born of panic. It was a coordinated tactical operation that would have made her old military unit proud. They'd identified their objective, assessed the obstacles, deployed their unique capabilities in complementary ways, and achieved their goal with minimal collateral damage to anything that actually mattered. Sure, they'd turned 3 levels of the station into what looked like the aftermath of a very artistic explosion, but they'd been careful to avoid life support systems, civilian quarters, and anything that would actually endanger the inhabitants. The reactor itself was untouched. The hatchling had been precise enough to dissolve everything around the containment systems without breaching them. That level of tactical thinking and restraint in juveniles was unprecedented and slightly terrifying if you thought about it too much, which explained why footsteps were now echoing through the corridor outside, accompanied by voices that ranged from bureaucratic panic to professional concern to what sounded like someone having a quiet, nervous breakdown. "Captain Violet?" Grack's voice preceded him through the dissolved doorway. "Are they?" The security chief appeared, looking like someone who had just discovered that his entire understanding of the universe needed substantial revision. His armor was scorched, his weapon was missing, and his expression suggested he was reconsidering several fundamental assumptions about his job. Behind him came Administrator Blaine, Dr. Kent, and what appeared to be most of the station's senior staff, all wearing expressions that ranged from shell-shocked to deeply concerned to professionally fascinated. "Everyone's fine," Violet said calmly, not moving from her position on the floor. "We're just having a family discussion about appropriate conflict resolution strategies." Blaine opened his mouth, then closed it again. Then opened it. Then apparently decided that words were insufficient for the current situation and just stared. Dr. Kent, meanwhile, was frantically taking notes on a datapad that looked like it had been through the same dimensional stress test as the rest of the station. "Remarkable," he muttered. "Absolutely remarkable. Coordinated tactical deployment of species-specific capabilities, precision targeting, minimal civilian casualties. This suggests cognitive development far beyond anything in our profiles." "They're children," Violet said simply. "Smart, scared children who didn't want to be separated from their pack leader. The fact that they're also incredibly capable doesn't change that. But the damage, Blaine began, is entirely repairable, Violet interrupted. Unlike the psychological trauma you were planning to inflict with your corrective isolation protocols, Grack stepped closer, his massive frame moving with surprising gentleness. Captain, we may have underestimated the situation. You think? The question now, Dr. Kent said, still scribbling notes, is what we do next. Clearly, separation is not a viable option. But we also can't have them. He gestured vaguely at the dissolved walls and dimensional shortcuts, redecorating the station every time they're upset. The kit looked up from Violet's arms and made a sound that was distinctly smug. The pup's tail wagged faster, as if it was pleased with the new level of respect it was detecting in the adults' voices. The hatchling simply continued its quiet chirping, which was beginning to sound less like laughter and more like a victory song. The solution, Violet said, is actually pretty simple. You treat them like what they are, intelligent beings capable of understanding consequences and making choices. You include them in decisions that affect them. You don't assume that different means defective. She paused, looking around at the assembled adults, beings from across the galaxy, each convinced that their advanced civilizations and sophisticated technologies made them naturally superior to a simple human and 3 alien children. And maybe, she added, you stop underestimating humans while you're at it. The silence that followed Violet's observation lasted exactly long enough for everyone to realize that the alternative to accepting her point was explaining to 3 different apex predator species why their offspring had been traumatized by galactic experts. Administrator Blaine cleared his throat with the sound of someone swallowing his pride along with his words. Perhaps we should reassess our approach to this situation. Reassess, Violet repeated flatly. That's one way to put it. Dr. Kent was still scribbling notes, his multiple eyes tracking between his datapad and the 3 youngsters with the kind of fascination usually reserved for discovering new laws of physics. The tactical coordination alone suggests cognitive capabilities at least 3 standard deviations above the established baseline for their age groups. The precision of their attacks, the care to avoid civilian casualties, the strategic thinking. They're not laboratory specimens, Violet interrupted. They're kids who got scared and reacted accordingly. Kids who can phase through quantum barriers, produce military-grade sonic weapons, and synthesize acids that can dissolve composite armor, Grack added quietly. His tone suggested he was beginning to understand exactly how badly he'd miscalculated the situation. The kit chose that moment to demonstrate its opinion of the conversation by phase shifting out of Violet's arms and reappearing perched on top of Grack's head, purring loudly. The massive Krillian went very, very still. I think, Violet said, trying not to smile, that's their way of saying no hard feelings. The pup padded over to sniff at Dr. Kent's boots, tail wagging in a manner that suggested curiosity rather than aggression. After a moment, it sat down and offered the xenobiologist a paw. Dr. Kent stared at the extended appendage with the expression of someone who had just been offered a peace treaty by a small, furry weapons platform. After a moment's hesitation, he reached down and shook the paw with scientific precision. The hatchling, meanwhile, had approached Administrator Blaine with the kind of cautious interest usually reserved for examining something that might be either harmless or explosive. It chirped once, a sound that somehow managed to convey both apology and amusement. Well, Blaine said faintly, looking down at the rainbow-scaled creature that had recently dissolved several million credits worth of station infrastructure. This is unexpected. That's the thing about kids, Violet said, finally allowing herself to smile. They're usually willing to forgive adults for being stupid, as long as the adults are willing to learn from the experience. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted what was turning into a remarkably civilized discussion, considering the circumstances. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving with the kind of urgent purpose that suggested the cavalry had finally arrived. "Where are they?" The voice that echoed through the dissolved corridor carried enough parental panic to register on seismic equipment. "Where are our children?" Ambassador Thekvar of the Nexarian Empire appeared first, a being that looked like someone had taken the kit and scaled it up to human size, then added enough dignity and presence to negotiate trade agreements between star systems. Behind her came war leader Grath of the Wraithling clans, whose resemblance to the pup was unmistakable despite the ceremonial armor and the expression of barely controlled fury. High Counselor Vexith of the Gorthak Coalition brought up the rear, moving with the fluid grace that suggested reptilian ancestry and the coiled tension of someone prepared for violence. All three adult aliens took in the scene with the kind of rapid assessment that suggested they were used to evaluating potential threats quickly and decisively. Their offspring currently engaged in what appeared to be diplomatic relations with the station staff. The human female sitting calmly in the middle of what looked like a war zone. The various station personnel who appeared to be in the early stages of collective nervous breakdown. "What?" Ambassador Thekvar asked, with the kind of quiet intensity that had probably ended several wars. "Happened to our children?" Administrator Blaine opened his mouth, then closed it again. Dr. Kempth clutched his datapad like a shield. Grak, who still had a purring kit perched on his head, looked like he was wondering if there was a graceful way to surrender. Violet stood up, gently brushing debris from her uniform. "Your children," she said calmly, "were threatened with forced separation from their chosen pack leader by bureaucrats who apparently skipped the chapters on predator psychology in their xenobiology textbooks. They responded by demonstrating exactly why that was a catastrophically bad idea." The three adult aliens exchanged looks that conveyed entire conversations in the space of a few seconds. "Pack leader?" War leader Grath's voice held the kind of careful neutrality that suggested he was trying very hard not to jump to conclusions. "The human female," Dr. Kempth said quickly, apparently deciding that scientific accuracy was his safest option. "The juveniles have formed unprecedented bonding patterns with Captain Violet. Our attempts to implement standard separation protocols resulted in unexpected defensive behaviors." High Counselor Vexith looked around at the dissolved walls, phase-shifted shortcuts, and general architectural mayhem with the expression of someone who was beginning to piece together exactly what had happened. "They did this to get back to her?" "They did this," Violet corrected, "because someone decided that traumatizing children was an acceptable solution to a bureaucratic inconvenience." Ambassador Thekvar moved closer to where the kit was still perched on Grak's head, her crystalline fur shimmering with what Violet was beginning to recognize as amusement. "Kithara, what have you been teaching the station about Nexarian capabilities?" The kit chirped something that sounded distinctly like, "They started it," then phase-shifted back to Violet's shoulder with obvious satisfaction. War Leader Grath crouched down to the pup's level, his armored hand gentle as he scratched behind its ears. "And you, little hunter? Have you been showing them proper pack loyalty?" The pup's response was a series of sounds that clearly described the entire situation from its perspective, complete with editorial commentary on the intelligence levels of various station personnel. High Counselor Vexith approached the hatchling with the fluid grace of her species, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested deep affection. And our young chemist? Have you been educating them about Gorthak problem-solving techniques? The hatchling's chirped response was punctuated by a small demonstration, a precisely controlled drop of acid that dissolved a circle in the floor exactly 1 centimeter in diameter. No more, no less. The 3 adult aliens straightened and turned to face the station personnel with expressions that suggested the next few minutes were going to be very interesting for everyone involved. So, Ambassador Thekvar said with diplomatic precision, "You attempted to forcibly separate our offspring from someone they had chosen as pack leader, despite having no legal authority to do so, no emergency justification, and apparently no understanding of the psychological consequences of such an action." Administrator Blaine made a sound like a deflating balloon. Furthermore, War Leader Grath continued, when our children responded to this threat in exactly the way any properly trained young predator should respond, by neutralizing obstacles and returning to their pack leader. You characterized this as aberrant behavior, requiring corrective intervention. Dr. Kempf tried to hide behind his datapad. And, finally, High Counselor Vexith concluded, you did all of this without consulting us, without considering alternatives, and apparently without any recognition that our children are individuals capable of making their own choices about who they trust. Grak, who still had kit fur shimmering faintly on his shoulder where the youngster had perched, cleared his throat. In our defense, the behavioral patterns were unprecedented. Unprecedented, Ambassador Thekvar repeated. You mean our children showed intelligence, initiative, and loyalty to someone who had earned their trust? How shocking. Violet stepped forward before the diplomatic situation could deteriorate further. The important thing is that everyone learned something today. Your children are remarkable individuals who deserve to be treated as such. The station personnel learned that standard protocols aren't always appropriate, and I learned that babysitting apex predator cubs is actually pretty good preparation for dealing with galactic bureaucracy. The kit on her shoulder purred agreement. The pup wagged its tail. The hatchling chirped something that sounded like applause. There is, however, Violet continued, the small matter of what happens next. I'm assuming that confining 3 young predators to a daycare facility for the rest of the diplomatic negotiations is no longer anyone's preferred option. Ambassador Thekvar smiled, showing teeth that suggested her species hadn't completely abandoned their predatory heritage. Actually, Captain Violet, we have a proposition for you. Violet raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. It seems, War Leader Grath said, that our children have found an excellent teacher, someone who understands that strength comes in many forms, that intelligence should be nurtured rather than suppressed, and that the best way to handle young predators is to treat them as the capable individuals they are. We've been looking for someone to establish an interspecies youth development program, High Counselor Vexith added. Someone with the right combination of military training, diplomatic skills, and common sense. Someone who understands that different doesn't mean defective. Violet looked around at the wreckage of the reactor level, at the 3 youngsters who had turned a diplomatic station into their personal obstacle course, at the adults who were slowly realizing that maybe, just maybe, there were better ways to handle things. So, she said, let me get this straight. You want me to go from punishment duty to running an interspecies kindergarten? The kit purred. The pup wagged its tail. The hatchling chirped something that sounded distinctly like, best job ever. Well, Violet said, looking at her 3 favorite troublemakers, I can't think of anything I'd rather do. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the sound of maintenance crews trying to figure out how to repair dimensional shortcuts, and dissolved load-bearing walls, Administrator Blaine could be heard muttering something about updating the station's insurance policies. Some lessons, Violet reflected, were more expensive than others, but they were usually the ones worth learning.